What's happening, hardscapers? This is episode 212 of the How to Hardscape podcast, where we talk about how you can start and grow your hardscaping business. And on today's episode, we have Jim Huston returning. He was our guest last week as well, and you should definitely check out that episode before you check out this episode. That was on the 5 stages of growth for our hardscaping landscaping business. And on today's episode, we talk about overhead recovery systems, and we do a deep dive into the critical analysis of each of them. And you should check out more about Jim Huston at jrhuston.biz to see his coaching, consulting, and his resources that he has available there. Now, this is a conversation that I've wanted to have with Jim Huston for quite some time, and seeing his resources that he has on his critical analysis of MORS, or multiple overhead recovery system, and knowing that there are quite a few people that use multiple overhead recovery system in our industry, and also softwares that kind of lean users towards that. But it's something that just I know would not work in my business the way I operate and run things. And I think that a large majority of businesses in our industry, I just don't think would make the best use of that system in their business, when they can make it a lot simpler and take a lot of question marks and take a lot of guessing out of their estimating process by using a different overhead recovery system. And it's something that I came to a conclusion of myself, and then when I found Jim Huston's resources and I dove a little bit deeper into what he was talking about, it did seem that a lot of our thought process did align, though there are some things that I know Jim Huston talks about throughout this episode that will differ also from the way I price things and the way I run my overhead recovery system personally. But the only way that we can move forward and learn more and implement more things that make sense in our businesses is to have these conversations and not just stick to one overhead recovery system, but to branch out and decide and learn more about other overhead recovery systems to see if they're applicable and or even better than the current overhead recovery system that we are using in our business, to price jobs more accurately, measure them more accurately after they've been completed, and to grow our businesses more profitably. So this is why I wanted to have Jim Huston on the show to talk further about this with us. And before we get into today's episode, we want to say a thank you to our sponsors, Cycle CPA. If you need bookkeeping, accounting, CFO services, reach out to Cycle CPA at cyclecpa.com. Let them know How to Hardscape sent you for $200 off their services there. And a thank you to Inlight Outdoor Lighting. If you're looking to add lighting to your landscaping business, now's the time. Reach out to Inlight Design. That's INLITE Design on Instagram to get that conversation started, or at least follow them to see a lot of inspiration coming from their Instagram page. And GPS Track It. If you're looking for GPS tracking in your hardscaping business and you're looking for asset tracking and vehicle tracking, reach out to GPS Track It at gpstrackit.com/howtohardscape. And without further ado, let's get into today's episode with Jim Huston on overhead recovery systems. Now, I want to talk about overhead recovery systems with you, Jim. It's something that has been on my mind quite a bit lately, and myself, I've got my own opinions on it, and I did come across a resource of yours online. It must have been a speech that you gave back a while ago with Landscape Ontario, where you talked about 6 different overhead recovery systems and getting into them. So it was great reading material. You also have your own book on your website there. And I don't know where you kind of want to start with this discussion, but overhead recovery systems methods. Do you want to cover as many as you want, or do you want to focus in on one? But I do want to talk about specifically multiple overhead recovery systems and your thought on that.
Yeah, there's also another seminar. It was actually a panel discussion with Landscape Ontario, I believe. It was in Toronto, and it was probably 7-8 years ago. And they built it as a job cost smackdown. And I had no idea what this was about, but it was going to be a panel discussion during the lunch period. And even I get up there, I have no idea what this is going to be about, but I showed up. And I get up there. There was a panel discussion with Chuck Vanderkoy, Mark Bradley from LMN, and another contractor who I can't remember who it was. They're all using the MORS system. Okay. And anyway, and so I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, where's this going to go? Anyway, so Mark was the moderator. And for a lunch period, we're on a raised panel in the platform in the front. And I look in the back of the room, and there's a big banner that says Job Costs Smackdown. They had a pair of boxing gloves. And I go, now I know what they want. And so we had a really robust discussion about this. They may have recorded that. I'm not sure, but you get a chance to go back and take a look at it. But it was really a lot of fun. I had just come out with my new book back then of it's called A Critical Analysis of the MORS estimating system. I'll hold it up here for a crass commercial here. I don't know if you see it here, but it's available on my website. I also have an audio book to go with it. But anyway, I think the best way to approach this is to sort of quickly review the commonalities of 4 of the 6 estimating methods. Okay. And here they are. They're factoring, materials times 2. There's the SOARS method, the single overhead recovery system. There's the DOORS method, the dual overhead recovery system. There's MORS, the multiple overhead recovery system. Then there's what I call market-driven unit prices, where you just grab unit prices that are common in the marketplace, so much per square foot for pavers, times, okay, this is the 300 square foot paver patio, $20 times 300, $6,000, there's my price. So you're just sort of grabbing prices out of the air from the marketplace. And then there's finally, my methodology, I call it the overhead per hour method. Some people call it the field labor hour method on there. But what's interesting, you've got factoring, SOARS, DOORS, and MORS are all using factoring on here. And what I mean is that factoring is a mathematical term. And for instance, if you take the formula 2 times 3 equals 6, and the 2 and the 3 are factors, the 6 is the product. So if you have the old saying, materials times 2 for a construction job, materials times 2, the materials cost and the 2 are factors, the price is the product. Well, the problem with materials times 2 or materials times 3 or whatever, number one, you don't account for your greatest risk factor, which is labor hours. And that's critical in all this analysis, is that labor hours, I'd say, present 90% of the risk in your business on that, field labor hours. So factoring doesn't account for, except for the materials cost, that's all. You can't job cost it. You can't monitor your most important risk factor, labor, on there. Overhead is just assumed to be part of that whole thing. And so this is where factoring is extremely inaccurate, but it's the common denominator with SOARS, DOORS, and MORS. Now in SOARS, single overhead recovery system, and a lot of CPAs promote this, and it can get you into a lot of trouble, but you simply add up your materials, your labor, burden, maybe equipment, come up with your direct costs, okay? And then you bump it up, 30, 40%, And so hence this 1 markup percent single overhead recovery system. And that can get you in a lot of trouble because you're taking the total of the direct cost and multiplying it by, like I said, a markup percent. Well, it doesn't identify the labor. It does identify the labor, but the problem is it's treating labor, materials, and equipment all the same as far as direct costs are concerned on here. A little later, I'll maybe get a chance to explain why this system can get you into serious trouble. Anyway, so then we get into DOORS, the dual overhead recovery system. And in 1993 or 4, NALP, that was then ALCA, published a book called Pricing that promoted this system. Well, and again, they're using 2 percentages, 1 times material, 1 times labor. But one of the big fallacies in DOORS is that all of your equipment costs are put in overhead. And that can be a serious problem. Okay. Well, so anyway, so you have SOARs, you have factoring, SOARs, doors, and then somebody came up with this multiple overhead recovery system. They saw the flaws in factoring, they saw the flaws in SOARs, saw the flaws in doors. Well, we're going to use 4 percentages, and usually the percentages are to mark up the direct cost. You're going to mark up your subs 5%, then add profit on top of that. Materials, you're going to mark it up 10% for overhead plus net profit. Equipment, you mark up 25%, trucks and equipment, 25% plus profit. And so the markup on labor is derived from a formula where you basically what's left over for overhead recovery, you put against labor. And so that percent usually comes out to be between 35 and 95%. So we would do a budget, and this is basically the Vanderkoy system, or MORS. He's the guy that promoted MORS, made it popular through his workshops and stuff. And I taught this method for 3 years when I worked with him back in the late 1980s. Okay, and then, so anyway, so but here's the problem, especially with MORS, is that the 5% on subs and 10% on materials, 25% on trucks and equipment for overhead recovery, those numbers are totally arbitrary. They absolutely have no mathematical justification whatsoever. When I was working with Chuck, we're on a flight from, I think, Chicago to Denver, and we're sitting beside each other. And so I asked Chuck, where those numbers come from? He hemmed and hawed and whatever, back and forth. And I realized that these numbers are just pulled out of thin air, and they mean nothing. And so anyway, and so if the markups on subs, material, and equipment are arbitrary, there's no mathematical justification. Well, and because the markup on labor is derived from those three, it's totally arbitrary as well. It has no mathematical justification. I tell people in any system, cost estimating system, number one, the goal is to estimate your cost accurately, number one. And number two, every number that you use in your bidding process, you should be able to mathematically justify on here. In other words, you should be able to say, okay, if I'm putting so much cost for labor in a bid, well, how did you come up with that number? Or what about the cost per hour for a truck or a skid steer or a mini excavator or a mower? You should be able to go back and reverse engineer that number and see where it came from. Well, with MORS, these numbers are basically totally arbitrary. They're pulled out of thin air, and they have no mathematical justification on that. And so that is the big problem with MORS or any percentage-based system. Where do these numbers come from? And people can't explain that. They, well, we get these numbers out of a book, and where is that? Where do they get those numbers? Well, ultimately, you have to accept these numbers on faith. I call it faith-based estimating. It's like you're going to be a true believer here. Glory to Jesus or something. I don't know, but you got faith-based estimating. Sorry, Jesus. And but anyway, but remember, he says to count the cost, and so we got to count the cost. But these systems, and what I'm looking for in these systems is where they estimate a cost inaccurately. The $5 million company he's talking about, he had a fatal flaw in his the way he allocated equipment costs to his jobs, and eventually it cost him his company. So I'm looking for areas where people are basically have an inaccurate method for calculating their cost in these bits. I'll give you a quick example about why the 5% markup on subs just isn't accurate. And you can apply this to the material markup of 10% or the 25% on trucks and equipment. The probably 25, 30 years ago, I get a phone call This is the early 1990s, and from a guy named Mike back in Pennsylvania. And he's a client, good guy, and we work together. He says, Jim, I've got a bid here that I need your help on. He says, I'm going $36,000 worth of in-house work. My crews are going to do it. I know how to price that. I feel comfortable with it. But I've got a $100,000 sub that's going to come in. It's going to, clear and grub this ballpark area. They're going to, grade it, seed it, put chute netting on it. It's going to cost $100,000. And I'm wondering how much I should mark it up. I said, well, Mike, what were you thinking? He says, well, the MORS method says 5% for overhead and 10% for a profit. And he said, yeah, about 15%. I said, well, Mike, how difficult is this subcontractor going to be to work with? In other words, how much supervision are you going to have to provide for this subcontractor? He said, I've done a lot of work with this guy before. He's a great contractor. He says, when it really comes time for him to do his portion of the job, I'm going to make a phone call, tell him to get started. He's going to do the work, and then I'm going to send a bill, for when he gets done. I said, well, let me make sure I understand this. You want to charge 15%, $15,000 for making a phone call and preparing an invoice. He goes, well, yeah. And I said, I'll tell you what to do. I'm a consultant. I'm here to help you. I'll either do the phone call or prepare the invoice, and we'll split the $15,000. So he chuckled. And I said, can you charge $15,000 for making a phone call and preparing an invoice? Well, if you can, I'd do that all day long, And just think about, one a day or even one a week would be some pretty good money. And so anyway, so he started, he realized that those percentages, the 5%, especially on the market, made $5,000 for overhead, which would be making a phone call and sending an invoice, dramatically overstates the true cost of what he'd have to do. Now, and again, if I can get 15%, $15,000 for that, that's fantastic. But in his market, he realized he probably couldn't get away with that. But my point is that percentage, the 5% markup on subs, totally arbitrary, has nothing to do with your actual cost structure. You make the same argument for the 10% on materials. And I mean, it's and in my book, the critical analysis of the MORS estimating system, I really get into this in great detail. And I said, listen, that 10% markup on materials, again, it's totally arbitrary. Maybe you have a supervisor on the job site who's billable, direct bill to the job, and he's ordering all the materials. And then, well, you don't have to mark up the materials, in this case, because it's already charged for his time to, prepare the purchase orders and all this sort of stuff, process the material and stuff. The one that really baffles me is the 25% markup on trucks and equipment. I mean, where does that come from? And so this is the core problem with MORS, is that it simply does not calculate your overhead cost accurately when it comes to these different categories. And I talk about it in the book, is that any time for overhead recovery that you are calculating that by multiplying your direct cost by a percentage, you're automatically making a mathematical mistake on here. And so this is where my problem with these different methods is not that I don't like them. I mean, it's just that they're not inaccurate. That's the issue, being accurate with your information and your data on here. And I give you a couple examples of how this flaw works itself out. And for instance, if you look at the categories for general administrative overhead cost, basically there's about 25, 26, 27 different categories. And, advertising, marketing, you've got rent, you've got all your office staff and overhead staff. You've got some of the other big ticket items. There aren't that many other than that. But you got your rent, advertising, marketing, You got overhead vehicles, the vehicles that the overhead staff utilize. So all of those items usually come up to about 25% of your sales. So if you're doing $1 million in sales, your overhead is probably around $250,000. Half of that is for overhead personnel on that. And so this is where, if you look at the categories, about 85 to 90% of every cost in general administrative overhead is incurred and paid based on a time unit. In other words, how often you pay your rent? Probably once a month. How often you pay your office staff? Every week, every other week? Okay. But it's based on time. And so so as I look at all that, I go, okay, 25% of your sales are probably the amount your overhead cost is. $1 million company, $250,000. And then 85, 90% of those things are incurred and paid based on a time unit. And so this is where now we're getting into how do we take that $250,000, and obviously we want our clients to pay that. Okay, I mean, we're just going to take it out of our pocket. The question is, how do we get that into our pricing and pass it on to the customer? And so and this is where, when I'm looking at those numbers, and I'm looking at how I'm going to do that, I realize that these different methods, whether it's my method or these, factoring, source, doors, and MORS on here, basically, again, I'm looking for the inaccuracies in that. But here's the dirty little secret, is that there's something more important than that methodology for allocating overhead that overrides all of this on here. And so what I've noticed in the marketplace in the last 37 years is that you need to be, for the different products and services that you provide, projects and services, that they have a gross profit margin that as a benchmark that you need to shoot for. In other words, let me give you some examples. Gross profit margin, of course, is the total of your general administrative overhead costs in a bid plus your net profit. Okay. In a normal economy, if you're doing residential landscape installation work, now I'm going to take the subs out of this because that's going to distort things, but just for the in-house work you're doing, no sub work, your gross profit margin on that work should be about 40%. In a normal market, in a robust market like we currently have, 40% is not a bad number to shoot for. Bigger jobs, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 projects, residential projects, maybe you're going to lower it down to 35%. So you get some economies of scale there. But so I don't care how you allocate the overhead to a bid. I'm going to add up all the overhead and the net profit in there, and then I'm going to look at the gross profit margin that you're putting on that work. And so it better be around, that 40% number. And again, you can use my method, you can use MORS, doors, source, whatever. The key thing is to monitor that gross profit margin. Okay. Now we get in a recession, that number is going to drop 10%. You're probably down to 30%, maybe even down to break-even point on here. Now, let's talk about the commercial landscape installation market. That market, usually your gross profit margin is going to be 25% plus or minus 5%. Okay. If you are negotiating work, in other words, you're the favorite contractor, if your price is reasonable, you're going to get the job, you want to bid it mid to high 20s. Okay. If low bid take all, you want to bid it mid to low 20s. You only get one shot at it on here. And so this is why you want to negotiate as much work as possible in the commercial installation market. If you're bidding maintenance work, whether it's commercial or residential, your gross profit margin is probably 35 to 40% on here. Lawn care, fertilization work, up around 50% gross profit margin. Irrigation service work, 50%. So this is where all these methods of allocating overhead are secondary compared to monitoring your gross profit margin. I almost don't want to say that because I popularized my method. And the thing is that I think it's the most accurate way to do it. It's the most easily way to measure all this stuff. But this is where when you start monitoring gross profit margin, then now you're really getting down to the nitty gritty. And it's sort of somewhat superfluous arguing over, well, how did you get that gross profit? Well, that makes sense. On sub work, what I've seen is generally people who are subbing out work, they're marking up that work from 10 to 20% normally. 15% just seems to be the average on that. I like to put it on as a margin versus a markup. In other words, I'm going to take the total of my sub cost divided by 0.85. That gives me a true 15% margin on that work on there. So this is where I think we can get involved in all these discussions about G&A overhead, but the important thing is, how do you define it? And don't put your field equipment and crew trucks in there. Keep that out of there. And then it's a question of how do you get it into your bids and your pricing on here. And so again, I disagree with Vanderkooi's method of MORS. I think it's inaccurate, and I can show it mathematically why it's inaccurate. Same thing with doors and SOARs and factoring on here. But I tell, because a lot of software out there does not give you the option of using this field labor hour method that I use. They only use the MORS methods, and these people have no idea where those numbers came from or if they're accurate or not. That's what they do. And so I said, okay, you're using that type of software that only allows you to use percentages. Let me show you how to calculate that on there. And so I go in with a lot of people, a lot of contractors, and show them how to use their software. And it's interesting. It takes, I call it calibrating their software system. And once I show them what we're doing here, it makes total sense. And then they're off to the races with good, consistent pricing.
You work hard to build a successful business, and because of this, it is important to work with companies that you can trust, rely on, and whose missions are to give you the highest quality product and customer support. Low voltage outdoor lighting is one of the easiest ways for you to grow your business and increase revenue. Using lighting can make you more profit, add that wow factor, and make your business stand out. Whether you are already using outdoor lighting in your hardscape projects or not, it's time you check out InLight Outdoor Lighting. As a professional hardscaper, we know that you need efficient installs, less callbacks, and premium products to have a successful and growing business. InLight's got you covered. They've created some of the most premium and unique lighting on the market to make your project stand out and wow your clients with their unmatched light quality. It gets better. InLight has an unbeatable customer support team, provides many educational resources like online and in-person training, installation videos, and so much more. They care about your business growth and will be with you every step of the way. For more information on how InLight can help you grow your business, check them out on Instagram at InLight Design. That's at INLITE Design on Instagram. DM them to find out how to put more money in your pocket this season. Now back to the podcast. So talking about systems of overhead recovery being secondary to monitoring gross profit margin, what about net profit margin? Where does that come in? Or is that more like a job costing aspect where you're looking at gross profit margin when pricing a job and then net profit when you're job costing to see where you were? Because companies can get really carried away with their overhead and find that their gross profit margin is at that benchmark. And then after the job is completed, where's the net profit?
Sure. On the front end, usually net profit margins apply to the different types of work. For maintenance, residential, commercial maintenance, normal maintenance, you're probably going to be, your net profit will probably be 10 to 15%. If you're doing residential design build or bid build work, I want to usually put at least 20% net profit on my break-even point. Break-even point being the total of your direct cost plus your general administrative overhead. So 20% for residential installation work. Commercial work, installation work, usually 10 to 15% is a good benchmark to start with. Now, if you can get more, by all means, get more on here, on there. Fertilization, I usually try to get 25% net profit. Same thing with Christmas decorations. Irrigation service work, a minimum of 20% net profit on here. And so these things, these all add up, and those are some pretty good benchmarks to start with. And again, if you get more, if you can, by all means, get more on there as well. Those are generally some pretty good things in a normal economy. If we get into a recession, people are going to knee-jerk down to a break-even point. They panic on here. And break-even point is just you're only covering your overhead cost plus your direct cost for materials, labor, and equipment. And then people tend to knee-jerk down to that break-even point in a recession for that.
Why not put equipment into overhead? And what problems arise, like you said, when companies try to do that? They put their equipment into their overhead costs there.
Sure. and again, the dual overhead recovery system, that's what they do. Your equipment cost with the depreciation usually runs about 10 to 12% of sales. Doing $1 million, your total of all your truck and equipment costs probably $120,000. When you put it into overhead, now you're averaging that cost on your jobs on there. And this really comes out in a recession. And and so if you're taking your truck and equipment cost and average, putting it all in overhead, you're averaging it. Well, what happens is you have some jobs that all you need are pickup trucks and wheelbarrows out there. But if you've got skid steers, mini excavators, and all that other stuff out there, you're putting an average cost for that in there as well. So you're overstating your overhead in that situation. Okay, well, that drives your price up higher. I'd rather be too high on that price than too low. The problem comes out when you have a job that you need your mini excavator, you need your trencher, you need your skid steer, all big trucks, whatever. So now your average is too low on there. And guess what? If you underprice your work, you're going to get plenty of work. And this is where a lot of people just haven't figured that out. But that's what happens. When I was talking about the guy in Boston, the $5 million guy, what he was doing, a consultant taught him this 30 years ago. He was basically taking his truck and equipment cost, which was $817,000 of his P&L. Let's call it $800,000. So on that $800,000 in cost, he had 80,000 billable hours in the field. So the consultant taught him to say, divide the $800,000 in truck equipment cost with depreciation and divide it by 80,000 labor hours, that's $10 an hour. So if you have a job that has 1,000 hours on it, for truck and equipment cost, take the 1,000 hours times $10, $10,000. That's how much you can put in there for truck and equipment cost. And there was the fatal flaw. So again, if he had a job that only required pickup trucks and wheelbarrows, instead of $10 an hour, he probably needed to be about maybe $4 an hour. And so he was overstating his jobs, 1,000 hours by $6,000. Hey, if you can get it, great, but in a competitive market, you want to accurately identify your cost and really identify your break-even point a lot more accurately. And so in this case, he wouldn't get those jobs. Okay, but the problem was, it was the jobs that required, and he had backhoes, he had big dump trucks, and you get a job that requires all that stuff and more. And here's where he needed maybe $15 an hour average. He was charging 10. He would underprice his jobs considerably. And guess what? He would get those jobs. And so, hence, when he told me, he said, Jim, the more work we do, the less money we make. I go, well, that's obvious. You have a fatal flaw in your pricing because it's your pricing is designed to get you all the work that you're losing money on or barely breaking even. And so that's what happened when you put when you average out your truck and equipment cost and allocate it that way. Let me give you an example. Let's say in in the U.S. or Canada, where you are, they passed a law. The legislators came up with this brilliant idea that hotel rooms um, that they're too variable. We're going to pass a law, and everybody has to charge $100 a night for a hotel room. Well, the Ritz Carlton, I've seen rooms there for $1,000 a night. You go to Motel 6 or some of these other places where you're afraid to sleep there. That maybe should be like $45 a night. My question would be, well, Mike? Where would you stay? Are you married?
I'm married, yes.
Okay, and where would your wife want you to stay?
Oh, she would want the nicer place for sure.
She'd want the Ritz Carlton for $100 a night. Now they're losing money, but the market isn't stupid. If you're willing to undercharge for a service or a project or a product, you're going to sell lots of them. And so this is the problem. The market ain't stupid, but contractors tend to be stupid. They can't figure this out. And so, the same thing with material. Let's say that for any job, you charge the same amount for material. Now, regardless of what the cost of the material is, you're going to come up with an average. And this is where averages can kill you. And this is why I don't want to put all those trucks and equipment costs and overhead, because now I'm averaging a cost versus making the cost job specific. That's the critical thing. Again, it gets back to accuracy, identifying cost accurately.
I just want to take a break from today's episode to talk about our sponsor, Cycle CPA. You may have a CRM or project management software in place, but what data are you using to ensure your estimating is accurate? Having a proper accounting setup and accurate bookkeeping done is key to understanding overhead expenses and other costs that must be recouped in your estimates. Cycle CPA is a remote bookkeeping and CFO firm that helps to connect the dots from the financial reports to the hardscape and landscape data needed in order to reach high profits. They provide landscape and hardscape industry benchmarking, job costing, financials by service line, advisory meetings, and much more. Cycle CPA's team of accountants are specialized within the hardscape and landscape industry, and you can visit them at cyclecpa.com, and for $200 off, mention the How to Hardscape podcast. Now back to our episode. Okay, so could you as a business owner say, like work trucks, which are going to go out on every single job, could you allocate that to overhead expense and the things that are always going to be on every single job, but the specific equipment that might go on this job, but not that type of job, that's where you would separate those and assign those to specific projects?
No, I would take the only thing I would put in overhead would be the vehicles that the overhead personnel drive.
Okay.
Managers, owners, that type of thing. And the crew truck, I'm going to build that into the price of the crew for the day.
Mm-hmm.
On that. Now, let's take a landscape installation project. I would come up with a cost of the labor for the day, the labor hours, labor burden, the crew truck, and overhead for that, net profit, that type of thing. And so materials I treat separately and with a separate markup. So on that overhead number, I only want to include the actual vehicles that the overhead staff are using on that. Everything else I want to put in the field on that. So if I have that landscape installation job, and let's say for the day the crew is going to be $2,100, $700 per man per day. Okay. Then I'm going to take my materials, and then I'm going to have all my specialty equipment, mini X's, skid steers, whatever. And I'm going to put those on separate with a cost per hour for those. Now, for materials, usually I'm going to charge retail price for materials when it's all said and done. For the homeowner is used to paying retail. The marketplace is going to reinforce that for me on there. And so I'm going to charge retail prices for materials, minimum. Equipment for a residential client, I'm going to try specialty equipment, mini X's, skid steers, and stuff. I might try to charge rental rates for those if I can get away with it as well. It's something to think about. A lot of people don't seem to understand, especially subs, but if you're working for the homeowner, you're going to charge the homeowner a retail price for your work on that. And now, if you're doing landscape installation work for a builder, general contractor, or so forth, now you're going to charge them a wholesale price, which allows them to tack on extra profit and charge a retail price to the end user. Does that make sense?
Yep.
And so I think that just makes a lot of sense. And if you're working with subcontractors, basically, if a subcontractor is working for the homeowner, they should charge the homeowner a retail price. If they're working for you as a contractor, you're sending the work out to them, they should give you a discounted price, wholesale price, so you can tack on profit and whatever and pass it on to the homeowner on there. Unfortunately, a lot of subs, they don't understand that. They go, well, why should I, charge, you, Mike, less than I'm charging the homeowner? Well, think about this, because you're doing the marketing for the sub. Let's say it's an irrigation sub. They don't have a salesperson going out every night and trying to sell this thing and pay them 8 to 10% for doing so. Okay. You're doing that for them. Plus, the other thing is you're giving them multiple jobs, not just one job. So you deserve a discount. Same thing when you go to buy materials is that if you go to a nursery and you buy either hardscape materials or plant materials, since you're a contractor, you get a discount. You get a wholesale price. Okay? And then that allows you to mark up the price, pass it on to your residential customer, and charge them a retail price. If the homeowner comes in and buys the same material, same tree or whatever it is, they're going to be charged retail price, and they should be on that, because they're only going to give the nursery, maybe one job, and it's just what it is. And so, but that's why you deserve a discount working with the nursery, the same thing as how that discount applies for whoever you're doing work with and also subs out there on that. But it's very confusing as to a lot of people just don't understand this.
I want to interrupt this episode to talk to you about GPS Track It. When it comes to running a landscaping business, the question isn't what do you do, but what don't you do? If it's not a customer that needs your attention, it's one of your drivers or one of your vehicles. But you already know that GPS Track It exists to help you know more than what you already know, like the most efficient routes to maximize your service potential, like whether or not your vehicles and crews are where they're supposed to be, like how to save unnecessary fuel costs and other costs. And we're going to be covering the benefits of GPS tracking in the future on this podcast. So we're going to continue with the benefits of GPS tracking, but we'll let our fleet advisors give you the full picture. Call 866-693-1291 or go to gpstrackit.com/how-to-hardscape. Once again, that's 866-693-1291 or go to gpstrackit.com/how-to-hardscape. Link will be in the show notes. Okay, Jim, last question, I promise here, but I've got plenty more questions for round two if you would ever want to come back on the show for sure. But the only thing that I can kind of wrap my head around with not allocating equipment to overhead for a business owner would be the cash flow perspective. If they're financing a piece of equipment and they have, say, $1,000 a month, and they end up not even using that piece of equipment during that month of financing, and so it's not priced on any project, I would say that would be the only kind of pushback to that. Is that something that you would say to a contractor then, hey, why would you own that piece of equipment? Why not just rent it if you're going to go a whole month without using that and still have that financing payment of $1,000 for that month?
Yeah, and this is where that I think you bring up a good question. And the problem with a lot of contractors is they get around to iron and their palms start sweating. I mean, they just they want to own this stuff, and so the dilemma is, or the sort of the standard is, when I tell people, it's just, you want to essentially be using a piece of equipment maybe half the time, or at least about a third of the time, to justify owning it. In other words, you need to generate enough cost off of that piece of equipment you're charging your customers to justify it. And if you're not, if you're going to, basically, it's going to be a lot cheaper for you to rent it. By all means, rent it on here. People want to buy all this iron, and they just can't afford it because they're not using it enough. They're going to have to charge it to their customers. And so what happens is they become iron rich and cash poor. And so you got to keep that balancing act, and you got to make sure that to me, it's like having 3 or 4 guys sitting in the back room playing cards and they're on payroll. And you're going like, well, I might need them someday. Okay, great. But they need to be billable. I mean, we need to eliminate those types of costs out there. Otherwise, we're going to really kill our bottom line on here. We got to make profits. So this is where, when it comes to equipment, try to be using it at least a third of the time. And, say, okay, basically, if I'd rent this equipment, would what I'm charging clients cover that? And maybe you are better off renting it. Now, there may be specialty equipment that you have to have. That's different. But like I said, people, they get around this iron, and they go to the Equip Expo in Louisville, Kentucky in October, and these guys are just shaking, and they're looking at all this equipment. It's like, man, they need to go to some sort of recovery or AA meeting for equipment. And I mean, again, I got my own problems with things I like to buy, but anyway, but we've got to be careful about that and measure those things and make sure they're justifying their existence.
Jim, it's been a pleasure to have you here on the show. I could go on for hours talking about this stuff with you. But for now, we'll cut it off here to respect your time. And Jim, one more time for our audience, where can they find out more about you, what you got going on, anything that you want to promote? Where can they find out more about you?
Go to our website, www.jrhuston.biz. Remember, the city of Texas, Houston, Texas, spelled the city wrong. We got to change that. And so, but go there or send me an email, jhouston@jrhouston.biz. And so that's where get a hold of me. We've got seminars coming up. We've got brainstorming meetings. We've got site visits. We've got a whole bunch of things that you just send us an email and we can point you in the right direction.
Excellent. Jim, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Mike. Have a great day.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast episode. Once again, check out more about Jim Huston at jrhuston.biz. That's jrhuston.biz. And once again, thank you to our sponsors, Cycle CPA. If you need bookkeeping, accounting, CFO services, reach out to Cycle CPA at cyclecpa.com. Let them know how to Hardscape sent you for $200 off their services there. Thank you to GPS Track It for sponsoring today's episode. If you need GPS tracking for your hardscaping business, asset tracking, vehicle monitoring, reach out to GPS Track It at gpstrackit.com/howtohardscape. And Inlight Outdoor Lighting. If you're looking to add lighting to your hardscaping business, reach out to Inlight Design. That's INLITE Design on Instagram. Message them to get that conversation started. Let them know that you heard about them on the How to Hardscape podcast, and follow them for inspiration from their Instagram page there. And we look forward to meeting with you next week on the How to Hardscape podcast.